Hi, I'm David. I made this video back during Davison month, and they were so impressed with it that I got invited to join properly, which was nice. I decided to opt out of doing a traditional intro video. Every time I attempted to write it, it was a bit cringe, and there's a precedent on this channel for intros being a bit cringe, so it's not happening. So I decided to do a little intro piece at the beginning of this video. This channel has a lot of different fans of all the different eras. Like there's the 60s, very clearly covered by Will. There's the late 80s, if you ask Matt literally any of his opinions, it will all go to McCoy. And then there's the noughties, and I don't need to tell you who's the fan of the noughties. Seriously, I don't. But nobody talks about the mid to late 70s, at least not regularly, and I think that'll probably end up being me, because big Tom Baker fan here. Also, just the weird and obscure side of this show, like the Unbound stuff, for example. And if I'm going to talk about anything, it'll be him. So, look forward to that. But for right now, let's talk about something completely different. It has nothing to do with what I said I was going to talk about. Let's talk about the grand adventures of the First Doctor. Every Doctor has their archetypal stories, whether it be the Earth invasion stories of the Third Doctor, the Base Under Siege stories of the Second Doctor, or the strange gothic horror pieces of the early Philip Hinchcliffe era. And if you ask any Doctor Who fan with even a cursory knowledge of the First Doctor, you'll get one or two responses about his typical stories. It'll either be a pure historical or a sci-fi story. And to be fair, most of the seasons have a marked gap between these two. Typically, half the season is taken up with sci-fi, half is taken up with historical pieces. But I think there's a third. These being the grand adventures of the First Doctor, which comprise of the Keys of Marinus, the Chase, and the Daleks' Master Plan. I don't have a CD or a vinyl or anything, so Master Plan.
But why do I claim these stories should be their own category, and what exactly do they consist of? Well, all three do share the same general premise of the Doctor and Co. exploring new areas, typically one per episode, with a general goal in mind tying each location into one narrative. They also consist of elements from the other two archetypes of the First Doctor's era, with sci-fi concepts at their core, whilst also visiting historical locations.
What is a ship, Ian? It's a sailing ship at sea.
Barbara, don't go wandering off, please.
I just want to have a look. I love sailing ships.
And the reason I argue they should be considered is just because of how consistent they are, popping up at least once per season. So, we've established the ground rules of what comprises these stories, and now let's get into the real meat and potatoes of them. I think it's best to first establish one thing they all have in common. They are all written or co-written by Terry Nation. Obviously, I don't need to explain who he is, but I do think it's best to explain why I think he was the good choice to write these stories. His greatest strength as a writer is world building, meaning he was the best choice for stories that take place across many areas. Let's take, for example, The Keys of Marinus. The story beginning on an island in the middle of a sea of acid with a mysterious pyramid in the middle, where the Doctor and Co are forced into their quest due to access to the TARDIS being blocked. Their quest takes them to many different locations. A deceptively gorgeous place which is hiding a seedy underbelly. A jungle in which the plants are out to kill.
Look! Oh, Barbara, don't you see? That's what he meant! Tempo of destruction!
A mountain so cold it will freeze anyone who remains on its surface for too long.
No!
I must sleep.
No! No, Barbara! We'll freeze to death!
A dystopian city whose justice system operates on a guilty until proven innocent line of thinking.
That is contrary to our legal system.
What?
I mean that you are already guilty of this crime. The burden of defense is entirely yours.
before returning to the island from the beginning of the story. The TARDIS crew never spend too much time at each of these locations, typically only one episode at each. However, due to the phenomenal world building, each individual location feels well established, and it's very easy to understand what makes each place unique and interesting. The story establishes each individual locations better than some classic Who 4-parters establish one, all being tied together with one unifying theme, that Marinus is terrifying. And this general theme of surprisingly well-established locations being tied together with one unifying narrative is a common link across these three stories. Another interesting thing to note is how these stories contain within their narratives surprisingly interesting concepts that could genuinely be full stories in their own right. I'd love to see that dystopian justice system further explored. It could be a really interesting story with the Doctor and co trying to find evidence to disprove an accusation, whilst facing deceit and hardships to fight a corrupt system at its own game. Or, for example, one of the many ideas within the chase. That being the Daleks creating a robot Doctor, a metal double if you will, to, as they say, infiltrate and kill! A trope very common in media these days, ranging from Mechagodzilla to the sheer quantity of robo-duplicas of Sonic the Hedgehog. Yeah, they're all original, by the way. But really, this is a very early example of it, and it could be a story in its own right. A story of not knowing who to trust, where the Robo-Doctor is spreading lies in a chaotic situation, turning the TARDIS crew against each other. Sort of like The Edge of Destruction, but with an actual antagonistic force. Instead, what we get is a small amount of deceit, then a brief fight between the Doctor and the mechanical menace, whereupon the Doctor wins and the robot is never heard from or mentioned again. Don't take that as a point against the story. I love the death of Doctor Who as an episode, it's just that it had a lot of potential. These stories manage to contain these ideas that could stand on their own and integrate them into their own narrative really well. And I think the story that best demonstrates this is probably the Daleks' Master Plan, as it features two plotlines that are entirely contained within this story that run parallel to the main narrative. The first of which is the character arc of one-time companion Sarah Kingdom. When we're introduced to Sarah, she is portrayed as a cold, calculated killer, taking orders without question, even going as so far as to kill her own brother, just because she was told to. She's utterly ruthless, but by circumstances forced to travel with the Doctor and Stephen as they endeavour to keep the Terranium out of the hands? Tentacles? Tentacles of the Daleks. It's through her time with Stephen and the Doctor in which she is exposed to the true nature of the service that she has followed blindly for most of her adult life. This rapid perspective change alters the way she views the world, and as such she becomes more of a free thinker, ultimately betraying her old masters to do the right thing, sacrificing her own life to save not only the Doctor, but the entire universe as well. It's truly a wonderful character arc, and it's only in half of the overall story, and I'd hardly even call it the focus, but it ties in so well with the epic narrative being told. The second of these is The Monk's Revenge. Coming off the heels of the previous story to feature the monk in Season 2's The Time Meddler, the monk once again, portrayed by Peter Butterworth, is out for revenge against the Doctor, after he left him stranded on Earth in 1066. He only really factors into 4 or 5 parts, but probably the most interesting thing about his involvement is he is nowhere near the focus. He plays a key factor, but we get to see an interesting side to the monk that we rarely see here, and that is the fact that he has no plan. He's thrust right into the Daleks' pursuit of the Doctor, and the way he responds is precious, because he is so utterly spineless. He spends most of his time sucking up to whichever authority figure he happens to be nearest to, whether it be the Daleks, Mavic Chen, or even the Doctor. Now, monk revenge stories are really not that uncommon. You need only look at, say, Big Finish and some of their output with the character, specifically stuff like the Locum Doctor trilogy, to see that. But I do so adore the way the monk and his plan goes completely out of the window as soon as the Daleks show up, creating a fresh way of experiencing this character seldom seen outside of this story. And both of these ideas could have easily been stories in their own right. What makes them even more fascinating is that they fall into one story as sort of the backdrop, and they somehow manage to do this with neither feeling unnatural. The final element that I want to touch on is what these stories have added to the greater Doctor Who universe. Take the Vord, for example. They were only really designed to be a one-off villain, but their unique design must have captured the hearts of viewers, as they have returned in really interesting ways via expanded media. Even so far as to technically make the Keys of Marinus the first appearance of the Cybermen. No, I'm being serious, look it up, these guys are fascinating in the ways they've been used. Or the Mechanoids. Once again, only really initially designed to be a one-off villain for both the Doctor and the Daleks, they have since gone on to evolve to become the ultimate Dalek killing machines. Terry Nation, when pitching his Dalek pilot to America, had envisioned the Mechanoids as the arch-enemies of the Daleks, where they would be in a sort of never-ending war. Picture the Sontarans and the Rusans, for example. Whilst the idea ultimately didn't get off the ground, it has been the baseline for every time the Mechanoids have subsequently appeared, with the most recent and substantial example being the Daleks Online miniseries.
So yeah, these stories are very important to the history of the franchise. They had a consistent archetype that they brought back once a year, so you could say it's a first Doctor tradition. And I feel like they should be considered their own category, if not just for the fact that they gave us this clip. That has to be worth something, right?